The plaster cracks, and you see her. Not a statue, but a ghost in reverse. The hollow space where a woman once was. The shape is heartbreakingly intimate. Knees drawn to chest, one arm flung across her face in a final, instinctive shield. Your breath catches at a detail so precise it feels like a whisper, the faint, perfect impression of a slender bracelet, forever circling the void of her wrist. This is the story of the final moments of Pompeii, told not by its ruins, but by its voids. To understand her last morning, we must rewind to the first tremor in the bakery of a man named Modestus, just before dawn. The floor moved first, not a gentle sway, but a sharp, violent lurch that threw Modestus the baker forward. His hands, reaching for a fresh loaf, slammed into the hot bricks of the oven's mouth. The sear of heat was instant. He cried out, more in surprise than pain, as a dozen unbaked loaves tumbled from their peels into the waiting ash. Flour dust filled the air like a pale ghost across the shop. Clay amphorae of olive oil rattled on their shelves. A single one tipped, cracked, and began to weep its contents onto the packed earth floor. Modestus was 46 years old. He had felt tremors before everyone in Pompeii had. The mountain across the bay had been grumbling for 16 years, ever since the great quake of 62 AD that had toppled half the town. You learned to live with the grumbles. You rebuilt with thicker walls. You propped up sagging colonnades with fresh timber. Life, after all, demanded bread. The city's 20 public bakeries and countless private ovens like his never truly slept. His work began in the dead of night, long before the first customer would arrive for a loaf still warm from the fire. He pushed himself back from the oven's heat, examining his reddened palms. The tremor lasted perhaps 10 seconds. 10 seconds of that specific, gut-level alarm that shortens your breath. The feeling of a sudden, sharp earthquake that makes you grab the nearest solid object and wait for the world to decide. Then it stopped. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the drip of the spilled oil, and the distant, indignant squawk of a rooster in a neighboring courtyard. Dawn was just beginning to bleach the eastern sky from black to deep blue. The August air was already warm and still. Modestus let out a slow breath. He wiped the soot and flour from his face with the back of his forearm, leaving a gray streak. He glanced at the ruined loaves in the ash, a day's wages for a poorer man, a minor disaster in a morning of minor disasters. He would bake more. He called to his slave, a young man named Felix, who was already sweeping up the broken pottery with practiced efficiency. No words were needed. They had a routine. Outside, the city began to stir. Shop shutters clattered open. The first water carriers made their way to the public fountains, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. On the slopes of the mountain, in the wealthy villas of Herculaneum, a retired naval commander named Pliny was already at his desk, watching the strange, thick cloud that had been forming above the summit. He found it fascinating. He would order a light galley prepared, in case he wanted a closer look from the water. Modestus knew nothing of clouds or retired admirals. He kneaded new dough, the rhythm of his hands a stubborn argument against the instability of the earth. It was just another tremor. The mountain had been grumbling for days. What was one more? Across the shimmering bay, in the naval port of Misenum, Gaius Plinius Secundus, Pliny the Elder, stood on the terrace of his villa. He was 56 years old, a man of immense appetite for knowledge and wine, for military discipline and chaotic curiosity. He had commanded the Roman fleet here for a decade, his study a fortress of scrolls and wax tablets, where he was compiling a natural history of the entire world. He had been writing since before dawn, his fingers stained with ink. The tremor that had thrown Modestus into his oven reached Misenum as a gentle rolling wave. It made the hanging lamp in Pliny's study sway. He glanced up, annoyed at the interruption, then returned to his work. Tremors were common. The mountain was a known grumbler. But an hour later, his sister shook his shoulder. "Brother, look at the mountain." Pliny pushed his chair back. the legs scraping on the mosaic floor. He walked out onto the sun-warmed terrace, squinting across 20 miles of placid blue water. What he saw made him forget his sentence mid-thought. From the summit of Vesuvius, a column was rising. Not the thin wisp of a wood fire, but something dense, muscular, and impossibly tall. It punched upward into the still morning sky, a vertical pillar of dark gray and black that broadened as it climbed, like a stone pine tree. Its top was beginning to flatten, spreading out against the high-altitude winds into a shape that would later be given a name: Pinus, the pine tree. To Pliny, it was simply remarkable, a cloud formation worthy of note. "Fetch my nephew," he said, his voice calm with the authority of a man who had faced storms at sea and barbarian raids on the Rhine. Pliny the Younger, a 17-year-old with a studious temperament, joined his uncle on the terrace. He followed the older man's pointing finger. "What is it?" "A remarkable phenomenon," the elder replied, already turning back inside. "Perhaps a new fire, though the mountain lacks the sharp peak of Etna. I must observe it more closely." This was the core of the man. The moment a curious mind sees something strange and decides to get a closer look, dismissing the danger as a secondary concern. He was a scientist before the word existed. The volcano was offering a demonstration, and he would not miss the lecture. He did not order a warship. He called for a Liburnian, a light, fast reconnaissance galley. "Have it made ready at the dock," he instructed a waiting officer. "I may wish to take a closer look from the water." The order was casual, almost an afterthought. To the crew, it was another eccentricity from the admiral who once wrote 30 volumes on the German wars while commanding a cavalry squadron. Back in his study, Pliny gathered his things. He slipped a stylus into a leather case. He picked up a wax tablet, the surface smooth and blank, ready for observations. He was going to take notes. This detail is critical. He was not fleeing, nor was he launching a rescue. He was embarking on a field expedition. The collapsing pillar of ash and superheated gas that would later define this catastrophe was, to him, a fascinating atmospheric event. His nephew hovered in the doorway, anxious. "Should I come?" Pliny the Elder looked at the boy, then back at the growing stain on the horizon. The cloud shadow now fell across the far side of the bay, darkening the vineyards on the slopes near Herculaneum. "No," he said, "not unkindly. You have your studies, continue them. I will return for the evening meal and tell you what I have seen." It was a lie of the most ordinary kind, the lie of a man who assumes the world will remain predictable until he returns. He walked down the path from his villa to the military dock. The sun climbing higher, the day growing hot. The tremor in Pompeii was forgotten here. Sailors saluted as he passed. The Liburnian bobbed gently in the green water, its oars stacked, its single sail furled. It was built for speed, not for survival. Pliny the Elder stepped onto the deck. The wax tablet tucked under his arm, he nodded to the helmsman. "Toward the cloud," he said, pointing across the bay toward the rising darkness. The crew, 10 oarsmen and a pilot, exchanged glances, but said nothing. They were under orders. The Liburnian pushed off from the dock, its oars dipping into the water in a clean, sharp rhythm. From the terrace, Pliny the Younger watched the small ship grow smaller, a speck of wood and purpose, heading directly for the spreading shadow. He felt a chill despite the heat. He would later write of this moment, of the perfect, ordinary courage of his uncle's curiosity. He turned and went back inside to his books. He would wait for the evening meal. On the deck of the Liburnian, Pliny the Elder raised a hand to shield his eyes from the sun. He watched the cloud. It was changing. The top was spreading eastward, a dark canopy that now stretched toward the open sea. The wind, he noted on his tablet, was from the northwest. It was pushing the phenomenon away from Misenum. A fortunate thing, he did not yet write the word ash. That same wind carried the first whispers of the mountain toward Herculaneum. On the city's elegant waterfront, where wealthy Romans kept summer villas with panoramic views. The day was still a postcard. The water of the bay was a deep, untroubled blue. Then the fish began to die. Fishermen hauling their nets found them not just empty, but hot to the touch. The sea's surface, directly offshore, began to seethe. Silver flashes turned belly-up mullet, anchovies, sea bream killed instantly by a sudden, scalding heat surging from the deep. They floated in a widening, stinking blanket. Men in their boats stared, oars slack. The water around them was suddenly a broth. This was the first true warning, a silent scream from the bay itself. No one in Herculaneum heard the mountain roar. They saw its effect in the dead, glassy eyes of 1,000 fish. Then the light changed. The sun, nearing its zenith, began to dim, not with clouds, but with a creeping, mustard-yellow gloom that seeped from the direction of Vesuvius. People stopped in the streets, looking up. The air grew still and oddly warm. A child pointed. "It's snowing." It wasn't snow. It was pumice. White-gray stones, porous and light as hardened foam, began to fall from the yellow sky. They clattered on red terracotta rooftops, bounced on the paved streets, and collected in the dry fountains. The sound was that of hail on a roof, but imagine it going on for hours without stopping, a relentless dry rattle. At first it was a novelty. Children darted from porticos to gather them, laughing at the strange, weightless rocks. Shopkeepers brushed them from their awnings with mild irritation. This was the mountain's deception, a harmless, curious shower. The Liburnian, cutting across the bay, entered a rain of this strange hail. The pumice stones pattered on the deck like dry beans. Pliny the Elder caught one. He turned it in his ink-stained fingers, marveling at its texture. He scraped it with his stylus, noting its composition on his wax tablet. Pumice, volcanic. The scientific confirmation. He now knew the source of the cloud. He ordered the helmsman to steer not for open water, but for the villa of a friend near Stabiae, downwind of the falling rock. It was closer. He could observe and perhaps wait out the shower. In Herculaneum, the novelty died. The gentle clatter became a roar. The pumice fall was not a shower, it was a torrent. The stones fell faster, thicker, accumulating in drifts. They blocked doorways. They weighed down vine trellises until they snapped. The yellow gloom deepened to a grimy twilight at noon. People who had been watching from gardens now ran for the shelter of their homes, hands over their heads as the lightweight stones became a pelting, blinding barrage. The streets, moments ago scenes of curiosity, were now choked and dangerous. The mountain was no longer grumbling, it was speaking in a language of stone, and the first word was a lie. The real sentence was still to come. The Liburnian galley, built for speed, now moved through the water like a man walking through chest-high mud. The pumice fall had thickened into a solid, gray-white curtain. It was no longer a rain of stones, it was a wall. Visibility dropped to the length of the ship, then to half that, the world beyond the bow vanished into a churning, granular static. The sound was a constant, dry hiss, like sand poured onto a marble floor, magnified 1,000 times. Pliny stood at the prow, a hand shielding his eyes. His fine woolen tunic, the mark of an equestrian and a fleet commander, was already dusted a ghostly gray. Each breath was a labor. The air had turned hot, thick, and carried the sharp, rotten egg sting of sulfur. It was the smell of the underworld breathed. He coughed, a wet, ragged sound lost in the hiss of the falling mountain. "Admiral!" The helmsman's shout was strained, pitched against the roar. The man's face was a mask of terror, white around the eyes, dark with grime everywhere else. "We cannot see. The rocks, they strike the water like bolts. We must turn back." Pliny did not turn. He stared into the gray void where he knew the shore of Stabiae lay. His friend Pomponianus had a villa there, directly on the beach, a place of safety, of observation, a scientist's refuge. "We press on," he commanded, his voice hoarse but absolute. "Steer by the wind. Keep it on the larboard beam. The shore will find us." It was a desperate order. Navigation was impossible. The pumice stones, some now as large as a man's fist, struck the sea with violent hissing plumes. They struck the deck with sharp cracks. A sailor cried out as one glanced off his shoulder, the force spinning him to the planks. The oarsmen, the Liburnians driving hard, were struggling. The pumice was accumulating on the water's surface, forming a strange sludgy crust that clung to the oar blades, stealing their bite. Every stroke became a battle against thickening soup. Think of driving through a blinding heavy storm where your wipers can't keep up. That moment when the world dissolves into a smear of gray and your knuckles whiten on the wheel. That was the galley's world now, but the storm was made of rock, and it was falling from a yellow-black sky that blotted out the sun. Noon felt like a deep, dirty twilight. For an hour, they fought forward through the choking gloom. The only constants were the hiss, the heat, and the admiral's unwavering silhouette at the prow. Pliny was a man of logic, of naturalis historia, but in that moment he was operating on something older, Roman obstinacy. He had given the order would be followed. He would reach the villa, assess the phenomenon, and record it. This was his duty to Rome and to knowledge. Finally, a darker solidity emerged from the gray. The low, rocky outline of the Stabiae shore, not the ordered docks of a port, but a wild beach. The helmsman, weeping with relief or exhaustion, guided the shuddering galley toward it. The keel scraped, then bit into soft ash and pumice already piled on the seabed. They were aground. The sailors slumped over their oars, gasping in the foul air. Pliny moved. He stumbled toward the gangplank, his legs unsteady after hours of bracing against the ship's violent motion. Two of his men rushed to help him, but he waved them off. He descended into the shallows. The water was warm, unnervingly so, and thick with floating pumice that crunched under his boots. He staggered onto the beach. The falling stones were lighter here, the torrent slightly lessened by the distance from the mountain's core. He looked up, blinking against the ash that caked his eyelashes. The villa of Pomponianus stood 100 paces up the beach, its white walls now stained a uniform. Dismal gray, smoke rose from its chimneys, a fire lit against the unnatural gloom, a beacon. Pliny allowed himself a breath, a shuddering inhale that was more ash than air. He had done it. He had crossed the bay through the storm of stone. He had reached safety, a solid roof, the company of a friend. He brushed vainly at his tunic, a gesture of a man trying to restore order. The gray ash was ground into the wool. It would not come out. He took a step toward the villa, then another, his servants forming a ragged escort around him. The worst, he believed, was the journey. The worst was behind him. The villa door was just ahead. He did not yet know that the mountain was merely drawing breath. 4 miles to the north in Pompeii, the world was turning to stone. The pumice fall had accumulated to a depth of a foot, a soft, crushing blanket that smoothed the contours of the streets, buried the lower steps of temples, and bent the branches of pine trees until they snapped. The air was a swirling, granular twilight, the only sound the endless, gentle tap-tap-tap of falling rock on rock. It was a sound that masked other, more terrible noises. In a narrow alley off the Via dell'Abbondanza, a man named Lucius pressed his back against a freshly whitewashed wall. He was a fuller, a cloth worker, his arms and tunic perpetually stained with the clay and urine used to clean wool. In his hand was a lump of charcoal, snatched from his shop's cold furnace. The world was ending in a gray haze, and Lucius, a man of no particular importance, felt a sudden, desperate need to be remembered. He scrawled on the clean plaster, the black lines stark against the white, 2 words, in rough, capital Latin letters, Sodom Gomorrah. He misspelled the second name. It didn't matter. The reference was clear, a city destroyed by divine wrath for its sins. He stepped back, ash settling on his hair and shoulders like premature gray. The impulsive act of writing your name or a message somewhere, not knowing it will be your last. A graffiti tag on a doomed subway car. A final post on a social media feed as the floodwaters rise. Lucius had just written his epitaph. As if in answer, a new sound cut through the gentle tap of pumice. A deep, groaning crack, followed by a shuddering crash that vibrated up through the ash-covered stones, then another, and another. The roofs were giving way. The elegant tegulae roof tiles, the supporting timber beams, they were never meant to bear such a load. A foot of pumice might be light as foam individually, but across a whole roof, it weighed tons. The first collapses were on the wider spans, the basilica, the palestra. The sound was sickening, a splintering crunch of wood and a cascading roar of tiles sliding into a deepening sea of gray. Then the houses joined the chorus. An atrium roof imploded, burying the central impluvium pool. A bakery's oven, still warm from the morning's last batch, was sealed under a mountain of rubble. Lucius flinched with each crash, the charcoal falling from his fingers into the ash at his feet. His message was complete. His city was coming apart. The rational fear of a strange cloud had just been replaced by the immediate physical terror of being buried alive. Safety was no longer a sturdy roof. Safety was out. He ran. He did not go home for his family. They were outside the walls at their small farm. He did not go for his savings. He turned and fled down the alley, his legs churning through the ankle-deep pumice as if through heavy snow. Every stride was a struggle. The Forum was a white-shrouded nightmare, columns half-buried, statues decapitated by falling cornices. He passed the Temple of Jupiter, where the roof had already collapsed, the sacrificial altar now a meaningless stone in a field of debris. He joined a stream of others, shadows stumbling through the murk toward the Porta Marina, the sea gate. Their faces were masks of gray, eyes wide and blinking against the sting. No one spoke. The only sounds were panicked breathing, the crunch of their flight, and the relentless building symphony of collapse behind them. Each crash was a house, a shop, a life being erased. Lucius reached the massive stone arch of the gate. He did not look back at the city he had called home, at the wall where his final misspelled judgment stood. He plunged through the archway onto the road leading down to the abandoned docks. The pumice fall was thinner here, the air slightly clearer. He allowed himself a gasping, sobbing breath of relief. He had made it out. He did not know that the gate and the road and the sea beyond were not an escape. They were a trap. The mountain's first breath was complete. Its second would be fire. The road from Pompeii's sea gate descended into a different kind of darkness. Lucius and the other refugees stumbled onto the old dock, a stone finger pointing into a black, heaving void. The Bay of Naples was gone. In its place was a churning, ink-stained soup, its surface littered with floating pumice like a shattered continent. The air was cooler here, but it carried a new smell, the sharp, metallic tang of sulfur, so strong it coated the tongue. Across the water, 4 miles to the northwest, was the only source of light, a hellish, pulsating orange glow at the base of a mountain that was no longer a mountain. Vesuvius was a ragged wound in the earth, vomiting a continuous, rolling fountain of fire into the sky. It illuminated the underside of the vast, spreading ash cloud in a perpetual, false sunset. It was silent from this distance. That was the worst part. Herculaneum, a smaller, wealthier town nestled at the mountain's western foot, had been closer to that glow for hours. Its residents, many of them senators and merchants with seaside villas, had initially felt safer. The wind blowing southeast had carried the initial pumice fall toward Pompeii. Herculaneum had gotten only a dusting of ash, a nuisance. They had watched the spectacle from their terraces, believing themselves spectators, not targets. But by midnight, the calculus had changed. The ground hadn't stopped shaking. The sea had retreated, then returned with a fury. smashing docks and beaching fishing boats. The orange glow had grown until it painted their own white walls in lurid, dancing shades of blood and gold. Several hundred of them now huddled in the fornaces, the vaulted stone boat sheds that lined Herculaneum's waterfront. They were sturdy, Roman-engineered arches of brick and concrete built to shelter fishing skiffs from storms. Tonight, they were the only solid things left. The wealthy matron clutched a sack of silver plate to her chest. The slave held a crying child, not his own. The old fisherman stared out at the unnatural sea, his lifetime of knowledge useless. They shared water from a single skin, the liquid tasting of sulfur and fear. Their eyes were fixed on the terrible, beautiful light show to the east. They talked in whispers, if they talked at all. The rational part of the mind had shut down. Now it was just animal waiting. Then the mountain changed its tune. The deep, constant roar that had been the world's background noise for hours stopped. A sudden, shocking silence fell over the bay. In the boat sheds, people instinctively held their breath. The only sounds were the lap of the toxic water and the child's muffled sob. This was the moment Pliny the Elder, gasping on a beach at Stabiae, would have recognized, the moment the column of ash and pumice, grown too heavy, began to collapse under its own weight. What followed was not sound, but the annihilation of it. A low-frequency thump felt in the chest more than heard by the ears. Then a roar that built from the earth itself, a rolling, tearing, catastrophic wave of noise that was less a sound and more a physical force. It was the concept of a wall of sound, but made of superheated poison and moving faster than a car on a highway. The glowing base of the mountain seemed to bulge, then surge westward, racing down its own slopes like water but moving at over 100 miles per hour. This was the first pyroclastic surge, a ground-hugging avalanche of 400-degree gases, volcanic glass, and pulverized rock. It crossed the 3 miles between Vesuvius and Herculaneum in under 2 minutes. On the waterfront, the old fisherman was the first to see it. Not a wave of lava, but a churning gray-black cloud, taller than the town walls, lit from within by its own incandescent heart. It swallowed the suburban villas on the hillside in an instant. It didn't knock them over, it erased them. He opened his mouth to scream a warning, but the roar was now everything. The surge hit the northern edge of Herculaneum. The stone boat sheds, built to withstand Mediterranean storms, met a force of nature they were never designed to comprehend. The superheated gas cloud did not flow around them, it filled them. In that single fractional second, the air inside the vaulted chambers did not heat up, it ignited. Death was not merely instantaneous, it was a physical transformation. The several hundred people huddled there did not have time to raise their hands. The thermal shock was so extreme their bodies vaporized their own moisture, their muscles and tissues contracting in a final, violent spasm. Their brains cooked in their skulls, the matron's silver plate melted into a puddle at her feet. The fisherman's final expression was flash-burned onto his face. The surge deposited a fine, deadly ash, then moved on, seeking every cavity, every stairwell, every basement. It reached the waterfront. The sea, meeting a cloud of gas several hundred degrees hotter than its boiling point, did not steam. It exploded into a violent, hissing rage. Water flashed to steam, creating a scalding, suffocating fog. Fish were boiled alive in an instant. The beached boats burst into flame, then were swept away as kindling. Within 3 minutes, the entire town of Herculaneum was buried under 60 feet of pyroclastic material, sealed like a tomb in a furnace. The people in the boat sheds were not buried. They were encapsulated, their forms preserved in the exact positions of their final agonizing seconds, their very bones turned to charcoal by the heat. Out on the Pompeii dock, Lucius saw the black wave consume the distant town's glow. He felt the hot, suffocating wind hit his face a moment later, carrying with it the smell of burnt stone and something unspeakably organic. The roar was fading now, replaced by a new, closer sound, a rushing, hissing cascade, like a river of sand flowing down a mountain in the dark. He didn't understand what it was. He only knew it was coming from Vesuvius, and it was coming toward him. He turned to look back at the arch of the sea gate, a dark silhouette against the ashen gloom of his buried city. There was no going back. He looked at the boiling, impassable sea. There was no going forward. He and the other refugees stood on a shrinking island of stone, and the mountain was already drawing its third and final breath. Dawn on the second day was a gray smear over the bay at Stabii. Pliny the Elder sat on the beach, propped between two slaves. The greatest naturalist in the Roman Empire was wheezing. His massive frame, built for libraries and warships, was defeated by the air itself. It was thick with fine, abrasive ash, the kind that coats the lungs. Every breath was a conscious, ragged effort. He asked for cold water. His friends from the villa stood nearby, their faces wrapped in linen against the falling grit. They had waited out the night, listening to the mountain's fury, believing the sturdy seaside villa was safety. Pliny had come to rescue them. Now he was the one who couldn't be moved. A slave brought a cup. Pliny took it with a trembling hand, the water already filming with gray dust. He drank, and for a moment his breathing seemed to ease. It was the helpless feeling of an asthma attack, of being unable to catch your breath in a room filling with smoke. He was a man who had written 37 volumes on the natural world, and the world was killing him with something as simple as bad air. Then the mountain drew its final breath. It was not a sound from the sky, but a vibration through the earth, a deep, subsonic groan that made the pebbles on the beach shiver. To the northeast, the dark, towering column that had dominated the sky for 18 hours shuddered, its core collapsed, and from the base of Vesuvius, a second, far larger surge detached itself. This one was not a ground-hugging cloud. It was a rolling, boiling wall of darkness, wider than the first, accelerating down the slopes with a purpose. It was heading for the coast. On the beach, they saw it coming. A stain of absolute black, swallowing the hills behind Stabii, moving faster than a galloping horse. The air, already hot, became a furnace blast. The slaves holding Pliny felt it first, a dry, searing wind that stole the moisture from their eyes and throats. Pliny dropped the cup. He tried to stand, using the shoulder of the slave for leverage. His legs buckled. The most famous scholar of his age collapsed onto the sand, a sudden heavy weight. His friends stared for one frozen second at the oncoming wall of death, then at the prone commander on the beach. The calculation was instant and brutal. They ran. The slaves, after a heartbeat of terrified loyalty, ran after them, leaving their master face down on the ash. The pyroclastic surge reached the villa's upper gardens, vaporizing the cypress trees. It flowed over the low cliffs and onto the beach, a tsunami of superheated gas and rock. It enveloped the body of Gaius Plinius Secundus, admiral of the fleet, author of the Naturalis Historia. He did not burn. He suffocated in an atmosphere that was not air, his great heart stuttering to a stop in the volcanic dark. The surge passed, leaving a blanket of steaming ash. Out in the bay, the few ships of the Roman rescue fleet saw the black wave consume the shore and turned hard for open water. The admiral was gone. The mission was over, and the mountain was not finished. A week later in Rome, the first reports arrived. They were fragments, carried by ash-stained couriers and traumatized sailors from the surviving fleet. A mountain had exploded. Towns were buried. The admiral of Misenum was dead. The details were impossible, the scale incomprehensible. Emperor Titus, only 2 months into his reign, received them in the Palatine Palace. He was a military man, a veteran of the Jewish siege. He knew the sound of catastrophe. He did not form a committee. He did not wait for clearer information. He walked from his chambers directly to the state treasury. The doors of the aerarium were opened, and Titus ordered it emptied. Not a loan, not a tax, a direct grant from the imperial coffers, a mountain of gold and silver coin hauled out into the Forum Romanum in plain sight. The message was, for the people watching and for history, the state would pay. This was the first state-organized disaster response in recorded history. Think of a modern FEMA or Red Cross mobilization after a hurricane, but with sailing ships and no radios. Titus was inventing the rulebook as the pages burned. He appointed 2 ex-consuls, men of unimpeachable reputation, to lead it. Their mandate was simple: go south, save everyone you can, and spend whatever it takes. The Roman machine, built for war and administration, pivoted. Granaries along the Tiber were emptied. The wheat harvest from Egypt, meant for Rome's bread dole, was diverted onto broad-beamed cargo ships. Medical supplies, tents, tools, all were loaded under the emperor's personal supervision. He stood on the docks at Ostia, not in his purple robes, but in a simple tunic, watching the last sacks go aboard. The image was calculated and genuine. The new emperor would be the father of his people, even if those people were already ghosts. The relief fleet sailed south on a calm sea, a dozen ships riding low with grain and hope. The 2 ex-consuls stood at the prow, squinting at the horizon. They expected a scene of fire and chaos. They expected survivors waving from rooftops, crowds on the beaches waiting for rescue. They carried manifests for feeding thousands, plans for temporary camps. They were prepared for a crisis. They were not prepared for what they found. The first sign was the light. As they rounded the cape toward the Bay of Naples, the midday sun dimmed to a dull copper glow. The air grew cold. Then they saw it, a gray desert where the coastline should have been. The lush green slopes were gone. The familiar landmarks, the villas, the temples, the fishing villages had vanished under a uniform monochrome blanket. It was utterly silent. No gulls, no human voices, just the lap of waves against a shore that was now miles of featureless ash. They made landfall near what should have been Herculaneum. The sailors waded ashore, their feet sinking into deep, soft powder. They called out. Their shouts were swallowed by the vast, muffling quiet. They found no one to rescue, no one to feed. They dug with their hands near the old boat sheds and hit a hardened, rocky crust. Beneath it, shapes. The consul ordered them to stop. This was not a rescue mission anymore. It was an archaeological dig, 2,000 years too early. The ships sat at anchor, their holds full of useless grain. The consuls walked the alien shore, their boots leaving the only marks in the new world. Pompeii and Herculaneum were not damaged, they were deleted. The relief effort had arrived, but the disaster had left no survivors to relieve. The empire's first great act of humanitarian aid was a gesture made into a void. All they could do was sail back to Rome and tell the emperor that his treasury had bought nothing but a lesson in the absolute power of the earth. The mountain had spoken, and the only answer was silence. The silence lasted for 1,700 years. The mountain settled, grass and vines crept over the gray blanket. The memory of the towns faded from a tragedy to a legend, and then from a legend to a forgotten name on a crumbling map. The Roman Empire rose, fractured and fell. The world moved on. The ash hardened into stone, and the stone was covered by soil, and farmers planted vineyards over the graves of cities they never knew existed. Then in 1748, a surveyor's spade struck something strange near the modern town of Portici. Not rock. Workmen dug down and found a wall. A painted wall with colors still vivid. They dug further, following the wall, and uncovered a room. Then a street. They had found a city without a name. It would take decades of digging and the discovery of an inscription before they whispered the old legend again. Pompeii. The dig was not archaeology as we know it. It was treasure hunting. Tunnels were driven through the solidified ash in search of statues, frescoes, jewelry, the beautiful dead things. The hollow spaces where organic matter had rotted away were ignored, collapsed, filled back in. They were voids empty of value for years. No one understood what they were. until 10863. The superintendent of excavations, an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli, stood at the edge of a trench. His workers had exposed another of those strange cavities in the ash layer. It was long, narrow, with smaller hollows at one end. Fiorelli looked at it. He had seen the bones found nearby. He had a theory. He ordered the workmen to stop. He had them mix a batch of plaster, a fine liquid plaster of Paris. Carefully they poured it into the hole in the earth. They filled it to the brim. Then they waited. The plaster seeped into every crevice of the cavity, every pocket, replacing the air that had replaced the flesh. It hardened for days, nothing. Then Fiorelli told them to dig, not around it, to dig away the volcanic rock encasing the plaster form. They chipped, they brushed, the ash stone fell away in chunks, and a shape began to emerge from the earth. A leg, a torso, an arm curled upward, finally, a face or the ghost of one. The plaster had captured everything: the folds of a woolen tunic, the tension in a calf muscle, the desperate angle of a head thrown back. It was a man. He had fallen on his back, his mouth forever open in a final, soundless cry. The cavity had been his body. The ash had been his shroud. Fiorelli had done more than invent a technique. He had invented a resurrection. Suddenly the voids had meaning. They were not empty, they were molds, and the dig changed. It became slower, more careful, a sacred exhumation. They began to find them everywhere. A group of 13 huddled in a garden, their small forms huddled together. A guard still at his post by the city gate, fallen across the threshold. A dog, twisted in its agony, still wearing its bronze collar. Then in a small room in a villa they found her. The cavity was delicate, curled on its side. The plaster was poured with a surgeon's care. As it set and was revealed, the details were heartbreakingly intimate. She was a woman. She had curled into a fetal position, her knees drawn up. One arm was flung across her face, a final instinctive shield against the world ending. The other hand was near her mouth, and around the slender plaster wrist bone, a detail so precise it stopped the breath, was the faint, perfect impression of a bracelet. You could see the weave of the silver, the clasp. The metal was long gone, looted by the first treasure hunters or dissolved by time. But its shape, the space it occupied in the ash, remained. It was a memory in negative. The plaster set. The form was lifted gently from the earth. The ash fell away. For the first time since the 6th hour of that August morning in 79 AD, someone saw her. Not her name, not her story, but her posture, her last moment, the private human shape of her fear. This is the power of Pompeii. It is not in the grand mosaics or the temples. It is in this. The volcano did not just kill. It preserved the act of living and the instant of dying with terrible fidelity. The bread in the oven, the graffiti on the wall, the braceleted wrist of a woman hiding her face. Seeing a photograph or a cast like this in a museum, that is the moment of connection across centuries. It collapses time. You are not looking at history. You are meeting a person frozen at the very second the world went dark. The mountain's violence gave us a gift it never intended, the perfect silent echo of